Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lecture 7. So, during the last lecture, we discussed the principle of consumption from the perspective of traditional Chinese culture. Now, as you can see, consumption is not a new concept, right? It's one of those things that human beings have been doing since the first man walked the earth. Now, at the same time, the ultimate purpose of economic development and consumption has never really changed. And the purpose of that is to realize happiness. Now, happiness is, of course, the goal. Therefore, consumption is just one of the channels. However, somewhere along the way, people mistaken the channel with the final goal. So we have to make this very clear. What is the goal here and what is the channel? So as a result, consumption becomes the end purpose of economic development, right? We often hear economic policy makers debating over, the best way to stimulate consumption and to boost demand. But we rarely hear people talking about achieving happiness in their economic agenda. So it is almost as if consumption is equivalent to happiness itself. Well, sometimes consumption do help us to reach happiness when we feel content and satisfied. But the problem is, this kind of satisfaction is short-lived. Either we are driven by endless desire, and always look for new ways to satisfy our growing wants, or we always unconsciously compare ourselves with the next wealthier person and feel awful when we cannot consume as much as they do. So for us, there's always something we want to get. Now, because it's physically impossible to get all that we want, the pressure that our consumption is always below our target to simply make us feel bad. This way, the feeling of satisfaction from consumption can never beat the feeling of discontent, only because the former is short-lived and the later never goes away. I guess this applies to everyone, regardless of personal wealth, rich or poor. So, how do we achieve happiness? Well, we must learn to find pleasure in whatever we consume. Happiness should be independent of the amount of consumption. It has nothing to do with it. It is only related to the degree of contentment. So, contentment is what we need to work on, not the absolute amount of consumption itself. So we will discuss the ways to happiness for both the rich and the poor. Now, generally speaking, the rich must be able to recognize his ability to consume and know that he has a lot. He must be able to regulate his consumption so that it is ethically and socially justified. The poor, on the other hand, may find themselves in a desperate position. So the ancient sages teach these people to focus on the spiritual side of themselves and raise themselves above material condition. Now, of course, this is not to deprive the poor of their motivation to make a better living, but a very clever way to help them to reclaim happiness while their condition is relatively low. Now, we'll spend much more time to deal with the happiness of the poor than the happiness of the rich. And like I said, rich and poor is only relativity. The majority of the people consider themselves as, in fact, poor, even for the really rich ones. And it has nothing to do with the absolute amount of wealth possessed. The principle of happiness for the ones who consider themselves as rich is contentment with means possessed. Now, we cannot emphasize this enough, that happiness does not come from how much we have, but it comes from how much we know we have. It's quite different. And more importantly, happiness is a function of how far away that we feel from enough. You see, that a physical possession is relatively fixed, at least in the short term. But the definition of enough is variable. It's not fixed, and it depends on how we like to define it. We mentioned before that in Chinese there is a proverb goes, happiness exists in contentment. It doesn't say that happiness exists in consumption, right? In the Analects, Confucius praised Prince Jing. Prince Jing was the scion of the family of Wei, okay, and because he understood the science of contentment and happiness, and applied the principle in family economic management. Okay, so he was in fact the prince of the state of Wei. Okay, so as the prince started to accumulate wealth to begin with, at the early stage of his family management, he said, see, we have some collection of things. And when he managed to increase the collection of wealth, he said, this is complete. When wealth was accumulated to such a level where the prince would consider himself as a rich man, he said, this is admirable. Well, I think the journey of wealth accumulation is very similar to most people, but the reaction of Prince Jing is quite unique. Confucius set the prince as a very good example of managing the household. He didn't talk about the technical side of management, but only the prince's view on his wealth. The prince was able to maintain a happy mentality, not because of his getting of wealth, but because he was easily satisfied. Now, some of us may say that the prince was not motivated enough, or he was not ambitious enough. Well, we don't know that. Quite the contrary, the prince seems pretty motivated because he had been working very hard in family economic management. The difference between Prince Jing and the most of us is that Prince Jing is always one step ahead of us and reaches happiness quickly. So he let the wealth work for him, but we usually work for the wealth. So the prince is not lazy, but simply easily satisfied. In fact, we can all be ambitious and clever at the same time. Otherwise, even if one were, let's say, an emperor and possessed all under heaven, still, nothing can make us happy.